July 25, 1944, in the shattered fields of Normandy, as the early morning light crept across the hedgerows, Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein stood at the command post of Panzer Lehr Division, Germany's most elite armored formation, a unit originally created not for ordinary combat but as a demonstration of German armored doctrine itself, staffed with veteran instructors, experienced officers, and the best-trained tank crews in the Wehrmacht, equipped with 93 operational tanks including Panthers and Panzer IVs, supported by mechanized infantry and artillery, confident not in numbers but in discipline, training, and battlefield experience, yet unaware that within the next 96 hours this division would be reduced to a shadow of itself, because at precisely this moment the Allies launched Operation Cobra, the long-planned American breakout from Normandy, and what followed was not a traditional battle of maneuver but the opening act of industrialized warfare on a scale the German army could no longer match, as the sky suddenly filled with the distant thunder of engines and wave after wave of American B-17 and B-24 bombers appeared overhead, stretching across the horizon in numbers that stunned even seasoned German officers, and within minutes the air above Panzer Lehr's positions became a roaring storm as thousands of tons of bombs fell in carefully planned carpet bombing patterns, turning fields, roads, forests, and villages into a single boiling mass of fire, smoke, and shattered earth, instantly obliterating trenches, command bunkers, communication lines, artillery positions, fuel depots, and ammunition dumps, burying soldiers alive and flipping tanks onto their sides without enemy armor ever coming into view, while shockwaves ripped through the ground so violently that experienced veterans later said it felt as if the earth itself was breaking apart. And from his bunker Bayerlein quickly realized that this was something fundamentally different from anything he had encountered earlier in the war, because this was not an attempt to defeat German forces tactically but to erase them physically from the battlefield, a realization he would later summarize with the haunting words, "This was not combat, this was annihilation." Yet even after the bombing finally lifted and the dust clouds slowly drifted away, Panzer Lehr did not immediately collapse, because German doctrine emphasized initiative and recovery, and surviving officers moved quickly to gather scattered units, re-establish chains of command, and improvise defensive lines along the hedgerows. Anti-tank guns were dragged into new firing positions, machine gun nests were reassembled from remnants, and the remaining tanks were hidden in ambush positions where narrow lanes and thick vegetation could neutralize American numerical superiority. And when U.S. ground forces began advancing behind the bombing, they encountered fierce resistance, as German gunners knocked out Sherman tanks at close range and infantry counterattacks briefly stalled the American advance, proving that despite overwhelming losses German tactical skill and battlefield experience were still lethal. But even as these localized successes occurred, the larger reality of the battle was impossible to ignore, because Germany was now fighting a war of attrition it could no longer sustain, while the United States was fighting a war powered by factories, logistics, and air supremacy, a war in which destroyed equipment was rapidly replaced and losses were absorbed by sheer industrial output, and this imbalance became brutally clear as every destroyed American tank was soon replaced by 2 or 3 more rolling forward from assembly lines thousands of kilometers away, while Panzer Lehr's remaining tanks lacked fuel, spare parts, and recovery vehicles, forcing mechanics to cannibalize burned-out hulks just to keep a handful of machines operational. As the hours turned into days and Operation Cobra expanded the breach in the German front, Allied artillery began pounding German positions relentlessly, aircraft roamed the skies uncontested, attacking any movement detected on roads or in open fields, making daylight maneuver almost suicidal for German units. Radio communications were repeatedly severed, coordination between battalions broke down, and isolated groups of soldiers fought on without clear orders, while Bayerlein himself found that his role had changed from commanding an elite armored division to merely attempting to slow its destruction and preserve what little combat power remained. And by the second and third days fuel shortages became critical, ammunition stocks dwindled, infantry units were exhausted from constant bombardment and lack of rest, and the psychological strain of continuous air and artillery attacks took a severe toll on morale. because no amount of courage or experience could protect soldiers from bombs falling from unseen aircraft far above the battlefield. And as German defenses continued to erode under this pressure, it became clear that the Allied breakthrough was inevitable, and by the time the fourth day arrived, the once formidable Panzer Lehr Division was almost unrecognizable, its command structure fractured, its support elements destroyed, its infantry depleted, and its armored strength reduced from 93 operational tanks to just 7 that could still move and fight, while dozens of others lay burned out, abandoned, or immobilized in fields and villages across Normandy. And when the order to withdraw was finally given, it was not a planned tactical retreat but a desperate attempt to save the surviving soldiers from complete encirclement and destruction, a grim march carried out under constant threat from Allied aircraft and artillery, marking the effective end of Panzer Lehr as a coherent fighting force. And with its destruction, Operation Cobra achieved its objective, shattering the German defensive line in Normandy and opening the road for the Allied breakout into France, accelerating the collapse of German positions in the West, and leaving behind the wreckage of what had once been the pride of Germany's armored forces, a division that had embodied the highest standards of German military training and doctrine, now reduced to a cautionary example of modern warfare's unforgiving logic. Because the fate of Panzer Lehr demonstrated a harsh and irreversible truth of the Second World War, that no matter how skilled, disciplined, or experienced a unit might be, tactical brilliance alone could not overcome overwhelming industrial power, logistical superiority, and total air dominance. And in this sense the destruction of Panzer Lehr was not merely a German defeat but a historical turning point, symbolizing the moment when the character of war itself had changed. When courage and experience yielded to production capacity and strategic bombing, and when the outcome of battles was decided not only on the battlefield but in factories, supply depots, and industrial cities far beyond the front lines, making the 96-hour nightmare of Panzer Lehr Division one of the clearest examples of how the Second World War became a conflict where industrial reality ultimately crushed even the most elite formations. As the shattered remnants of Panzer Lehr Division struggled westward after the collapse caused by Operation Cobra, the reality facing the German army in Normandy grew even darker, because the destruction of this elite formation was not an isolated disaster but a warning sign of a front that was rapidly unraveling, and for Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein and the surviving officers, the retreat marked the painful transition from mobile armored warfare to a desperate fight for survival, as scattered battalions attempted to regroup behind new defensive lines that existed more on maps than in reality, since Allied air power made daylight movement nearly impossible and every road, bridge, and crossroads became a potential death trap, forcing German columns to move at night, abandoning heavy equipment along the way when fuel ran out or engines failed, while American armored spearheads pushed relentlessly forward through the growing gaps in the German front, supported by overwhelming artillery and constant reconnaissance aircraft that denied the Germans any chance to stabilize the situation. And as Panzer Lehr faded from the order of battle, its fate was mirrored by other German units across Normandy that were suffering similar attrition, revealing that the Allied breakthrough was not merely tactical but systemic, undermining the entire German defensive structure in the West, because the loss of experienced crews, vehicles, and command cohesion could not be replaced, while the United States continued to pour fresh divisions, tanks, trucks, and supplies into France at a pace that defied German expectations. And for Bayerlein, the destruction of his division carried a deeper significance, as Panzer Lehr had been created to embody the ideal of German armored warfare, combining speed, coordination, and tactical precision. Yet its annihilation demonstrated that even the most perfectly trained unit could be rendered powerless when confronted by an enemy that controlled the air, possessed superior logistics, and could absorb losses without hesitation. And this realization spread rapidly through the German high command, where officers increasingly recognized that the war in the West was slipping beyond their ability to control, not because of a lack of courage or competence, but because Germany no longer possessed the material resources required to fight a modern industrial war, a fact that became painfully evident as attempts to organize counterattacks faltered due to fuel shortages, destroyed rail lines, and constant Allied air interdiction, while German soldiers on the ground found themselves fighting under conditions where even basic resupply was uncertain, rations were scarce, ammunition had to be conserved, and wounded men often could not be evacuated in time, adding to the psychological burden already imposed by relentless bombing and artillery fire. And as the retreat continued toward the Seine, the German army increasingly resembled a force in controlled collapse rather than an organized fighting machine, with units intermingled, command structures fragmented, and orders delayed or rendered meaningless by rapidly changing conditions on the ground. And yet despite this deterioration, many German soldiers continued to fight with determination, setting up rearguard actions, destroying bridges, and delaying Allied advances wherever possible, not out of confidence in victory but out of duty, discipline, and a desire to protect their comrades, while Bayerlein himself later reflected that the courage of individual soldiers remained intact even as the strategic situation became hopeless, highlighting the tragic contrast between human resilience and strategic inevitability. And as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and raced across France, the destruction of Panzer Lehr came to be seen in retrospect as one of the decisive moments that made this rapid advance possible, because the removal of such a powerful armored formation from the battlefield deprived the German army of one of its few remaining tools for mobile defense, leaving gaps that could no longer be sealed, and this loss had consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield, influencing German operational planning for the rest of the campaign, as increasingly defensive strategies replaced any realistic hope of regaining the initiative, while Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs further compounded the problem by preventing timely withdrawals that might have preserved combat power. And for the surviving veterans of Panzer Lehr, the memory of those 96 hours became a defining experience, a symbol of a war that had changed beyond recognition, where battles were no longer decided primarily by maneuver and firepower at the front line, but by production figures, fuel availability, and control of the skies. And in post-war accounts, Bayerlein and other officers repeatedly returned to this theme, emphasizing that Normandy marked the moment when German tactical superiority, so effective earlier in the war, was finally overwhelmed by the Allied ability to coordinate air, ground, and logistical power on an unprecedented scale, making resistance increasingly futile regardless of local success. And this broader lesson extended beyond the German experience, serving as a case study for modern militaries around the world, illustrating how even elite units can be neutralized when deprived of air cover, resupply, and operational freedom, and how industrial capacity and logistics ultimately shape the outcome of prolonged conflicts. And in this sense, the destruction of Panzer Lehr did not merely represent the end of a division but the end of an era, the final proof that the style of warfare perfected by Germany in the early years of the Second World War could no longer succeed in a conflict dominated by mass production, strategic bombing, and combined arms coordination on a global scale, ensuring that the nightmare that began on July 25, 1944, continued far beyond those initial 96 hours. Echoing through the collapse of the German position in France, the retreat toward Germany's borders, and ultimately the outcome of the war itself, as the fate of Panzer Lehr became a lasting reminder that in modern war, bravery and skill, while essential, cannot stand alone against an enemy whose true strength lies in its ability to replace losses faster than they can be inflicted, making the story of this elite division not just a German tragedy, but a universal lesson in the unforgiving logic of industrialized warfare.